And now, back to the Dr. A Show with your host, Dr. Will Aguila.
Caroline Adams Miller is a graduate of Harvard University and one of the first graduates of the University of Pennsylvania's Master of Applied Positive Psychology program. She is a credentialed coach and has taught in many academic settings, including New York University School of Continuing and Professional Studies. Caroline's books, starting with the groundbreaking My Name is Caroline in 1988, have been translated into multiple languages and have been featured in the worldwide media. Her newest book is titled Positively Caroline, How I Beat Bulimia for Good. Well, hi, Caroline. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Now, let's start with the basics, Caroline, so that we're all clear about the terms. What is bulimia, and what is the difference between bulimia and anorexia?
Okay, bulimia is kind of commonly known as the binge-purge syndrome, but it is not just binging and purging your food. You can overdose on laxatives, you can overdose on exercise, you can binge and then not eat for several days, but there's usually a binging component, thousands of calories in one sitting quite often. It's very, very common. You're 8 to 10 times more likely to know a bulimic than an anorexic. And part of the reason why... Well, anorexia is very rare. And, the thing about anorexia is that you can spot it. It's very hard to escape notice by other people. And bulimia is, the girl next door quite often. You don't have wide weight fluctuations with bulimia quite often. In fact, nobody could detect my eating disorder. And that's why I went undetected for 7 years. It's hard to spot.
Well, how did you eat? I mean, did you eat thousands of calories in front of other people, or?
Well, I was a competitive swimmer, so I could get away with eating a lot of calories in one sitting. But most of my eating was done in secret, or I'd eat some with some people, and then I'd move on in secrecy to an ice cream store. I really hit my bottom when I was in college, and I had unrestricted dining halls. So 2 girls showed me how to binge and purge in my high school in Washington, D.C., kind of this overprivileged, prep school where there's a lot of pressure, and combine that with my swimming and just a lot of pressure to be quote-unquote perfect. And they showed me how to purge my food after a meal because I overheard them doing it, and the next thing I knew, I was hooked. I couldn't stop. And I would quite often, perform this ritual when I was babysitting, but usually whenever I was alone. And so that is why very few, well, actually I would say nobody really noticed. A few people noticed that I was behaving differently, or I was depressed, or I was withdrawn, but there wasn't one person in all, I think it was almost 8 years of this behavior, who ever confronted me and said, "Can we talk? Is something wrong?"
How early does this start, or how early can it start?
Well, it seems to be starting earlier and earlier. I was reading an article this morning about, I think it's in New Zealand, they're starting to see boys even as young as 9 and 10 being hospitalized. But I do think that with girls, it tends to start between 8 and 12. Puberty is quite a trigger. And it often is...
Tell me why. Tell me why puberty is a trigger.
Well, when your body begins to change, you're suddenly sprouting up, you're getting breasts, you're having all kinds of changes. You can get unwanted attention from men and boys. And in swimming, and I was a swimmer, the minute my body started to change, coaches make a lot of, comments about, well, can you swim that fast? Or in gymnastics and figure skating and other kinds of sports where there's a real premium placed on being light, it's seen as an impediment to performance. And that is why there's so many eating disorders in sports like gymnastics, figure skating, even being an equestrian. So as the body changes and changes quickly, and I think you put on at least 50% or more of your lifetime fat stores in the years between, say, 8 and 12. So you're laying down an enormous amount of fat that you need and changes in a few short years, and that can be very disorienting. So, some people try to stop the process by taking control over their eating and can take it to an extreme point where they become infertile, for example. I was afraid I couldn't have children, and a lot of things happened to my body. Some were irreversible and some were not.
But tell us a little bit about the things that can happen with bulimia as far as your body physically.
Well, it's a really long list. You can have tooth decay, goiters, potassium imbalances, You see a lot
of course, the potassium imbalance can actually cause a cardiac arrhythmia, and you can die from it.
Yes, and
so
from what I
that's
gather about
there.
Karen Carpenter was a prime victim.
Right.
She was a syrup of Ipecac user, apparently, and that's a piece of what led to her death. Delayed menstruation, if not completely stopping menstruation, and you can be stunted in your growth. Your eyesight can change. I mean, it's really long. And then when you get to the point where you understand that eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of all psychiatric illnesses, that's because it's tied in with depression and cutting and all kinds of other behaviors that go along with it. So it's really a very, very dangerous obsession to get started with.
Does an attack on your self-esteem seem to play a major role in bulimia, especially early on in life?
I don't know that I would make that link necessarily. I didn't start because I had low self-esteem. I started because I thought I would be a faster swimmer.
I see. Okay. But how about self-image? Perhaps being told early on that you're too fat, or you need to get on a diet, you need to lose some weight.
Yeah,
that can trigger people.
Yeah. Well, I think there is usually a comment about a young woman's body that they point to as one of the turning points when they began to become obsessed with their weight or their body. And in my case, in my first book, My Name is Caroline, I talk about remembering this moment when I was 8 years old. And my father said to the waitress at a Howard Johnson's restaurant, the vanilla milkshake goes to the heavy one. And at that moment, I had never, ever considered myself as anything other than kind of bright and lively and curious and a good student and all those things. But to have the word heavy applied to me, knowing that was a bad thing, at least that's the way I felt society perceived it to be bad, I never looked at myself the same after that day.
Is it common to be in denial about an eating problem like this for a long time?
No. With bulimia, what's interesting is you tend to know what you're doing is wrong. You just can't stop. So there was no denial that I had a problem. I just had no idea what to do about it because back in the early 1980s, there was no recovery. There were no books. There were no first-person accounts of people getting better. Therefore, without any role models, there really wasn't any hope. And that is what drove me to write the first autobiography way back then in 1988 by a survivor of bulimia because I was so compelled to want to tell the truth about it because all those years I'm going, and hating myself and buying this food and vomiting in these dark, solitary bathrooms, pounding on my stomach till I was, had nothing else to give up. Just thinking, I don't want to do this. It's not that I'm not bright or accomplished. I was at Harvard University, of all places, surrounded by lots of eating disorders, by the way. I had good grades. I was a good student. I was a good athlete. So this wasn't necessarily something that was an issue of low willpower, but I knew what I was doing. I wasn't deluded at all. I was just terrified and had no hope.
And how about guilt? Does that play a major role in this, in promoting the addiction?
I don't know if it promoted the addiction necessarily, but it becomes a very guilty cycle because about 60% of bulimics I've read become kleptomaniacs because you really can't.
Right?
Yeah, you can't keep up with the vast amounts of food that this addiction begins to require. So you're either...
How many calories? How many calories? Give the listeners an example of how many calories that is.
I think it varies from person to person, but I've seen estimates as high as 60,000 calories in a day.
Wow.
And that's a lot.
Wow.
But when you're spending all day, and some days are like this, when you're alone and you can get away with this, you are binging and purging literally all day long, and you can have an entire cake and a gallon of ice cream in one sitting. And I don't know what that adds up to calorically, but it's a lot. And then, I know women who've driven, to drive-through after drive-through, just buying as much as they could, eating as much as they could, and then finding a place to vomit, sometimes just into garbage bags. And also I know people who've been thrown out of all-you-can-eat restaurants because the other patrons would see what they were doing and would hear them in the bathroom. Yeah. Now, I was very ashamed of what I was doing, so nobody knew. it can be kind of a group activity in sororities, believe it or not, where everybody knows, and there's no shame really attached to it. But I was very, very ashamed of myself, and I felt guilty because of the money I was both stealing and using to buy food. I was stealing food. But again, it's not uncommon because you become somebody you're not, because the disease pushes you there. And it wasn't until I understood it was a disease I began to see this is like alcoholism. I certainly knew alcoholics, but I didn't really have control over it. It was running my life, and that was terrible. For somebody with my background or my pedigree, my great uncles went 1-2 in the Olympics in 1912. I mean, just high achievement, high athletic performance, winners. You can just say we're a bunch of winners. I wasn't winning. I was losing, and I was losing every day, all day.
Let's talk a little bit more about that and how you overcame that on the next segment. Is it possible to recover from bulimia and lead a happy life? Find out when the Dr. A Show continues with best-selling author of Positviley Caroline. Stay with us.
And now, back to the Dr. A Show with your host, Dr. Will Aguila.
Welcome back to the show. We're speaking with Caroline Adams, author of Positively Caroline, How I Beat Bulimia for Good. Caroline, before the break, we were talking about how bulimia is rather prevalent, and eating disorders in general, in all social aspects, including in college hazings, etc. You really opened my eyes. I knew this was a problem, but I didn't realize it was that extensive. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I have a number of books out, and the first 3 were about eating disorders and depression and all the rest of that. And what happened was I ended up getting probably well over 100,000 letters from all over the world. I was in the media a lot, and so I think that also allowed people to reach out to me because I was one of the very, very few people who would talk about it. And because of that, I got letters from people whose names you would recognize, the people who worked in the White House, people in political families that everyone would know,
wow.
Even palaces around the world, because people feel trapped by this and they don't know where to go, and they want to talk to somebody, and this is really important. They want to talk to somebody who overcame it. They want to literally touch you, feel you, talk to you, because if they do, and this is what had to happen to me, they have hope. And when you have hope, just about anything's possible.
Well, you emphasize that recovery is a long-term plan. Is it difficult for most people that are suffering from bulimia to understand this?
Well, I think we live in a society where everybody wants everything to be quick. The reason I wrote Positively Caroline, which is actually under my full name, Caroline Miller, if anyone's going to look for it, is because there are no long-term recovering role models out there. If there are, they're just not well known. So I think I've written the first autobiography about how I got into decades of recovery, because nobody is holding up that light saying, look, you can get better and stay better. And I think that has contributed to the fact that very few people get better and stay better. I've seen an estimate of maybe 30% of people get better. Part of the problem, I do believe, is it's not seen as common. People don't know people who get better and stay better, therefore they become hopeless. The most common people you see talking about recovery are celebrities and starlets who've maybe got 1 year of recovery, or they come right out of a treatment center and they run onto a talk show. That's not real recovery. Yeah. And so I feel very strongly that before anyone goes public, they need to have solid recovery, because if you slip and somebody has put you on a pedestal, whether you intend that or not, because you went public too soon, that can really have damaging consequences, whether you know it or not. So I really would like to see people talking about how did they get better, how did they stay better, because I'm not the only one. I'm just one of the few who's willing to really talk about it and say, I'm not ashamed of this. This is a piece of what made me who I am. And I love who I am. I'm successful. I've made a life for myself. I have 3 wonderful children, a 30-year marriage. But this eating disorder, overcoming this, is the thing I am proudest of in my entire life, because this is what taught me what I'm made of. And I have a lot of strength, and people can do it too.
Let's talk a little bit about how you overcame that battle with bulimia.
Well, I hit bottom in early 1984, and I went to really my last gasp attempt at finding help, because back then there were like padded rooms in psych hospitals, and that was kind of the extent of treatment. It was very hard to find good places, certainly no residential centers. And a woman across the room from me said, "Hi, my name is Betsy, and I'm recovering from bulimia one day at a time." And I had never, ever heard those words in one sentence. I'd never heard anybody talk openly about bulimia, let alone say they were in recovery. And that night was the night I began to recover because I was hopeful. I thought, if she can do it, I can do it. And that is the way hope theory works. I've studied hope theory. I know what happened. And so I began to literally one day at a time create a different meal plan. I stuck with the winners. I stayed around people in recovery. I think one of the most important factors, and I go into at the end of Positviley Caroline, what I believe I did differently that allowed me to be in this, minority of people who get better and stay better. I stopped drinking alcohol. And there's a lot of addiction in my family, and certainly a lot of bulimics come from families where alcoholism is rampant. And I believe that by taking that off the table 30 years ago, I took away one of the biggest deterrents to willpower out there. And so I stopped drinking, and it was a game changer for me.
Let's explain that, because a lot of people will switch addictions. And
yeah, I would go to meetings for recovering alcoholics, and I would see a lot of sober alcoholics who were now food addicts. And they were told by, say, their sponsors and other people around them, it's okay if you're sober. You can do anything else because sobriety is all that matters. And I totally disagree.
Totally.
Yeah,
and you really have to go after your root causes, and that's something you stress in your book.
Yes.
One of your root causes apparently was the borderline personality parent that you had, your mom.
Yes.
And a borderline personality parent will select one of their children. They'll despise that child. They'll try to steal their joy and their soul. And apparently this is what happened to you with your mom.
And it was interesting how my definition of recovery did have to evolve. If I was going to stay in recovery, I had to go beyond not just seeing it as stopping binging and purging. I had to then look at, lifelong predisposition for depression, undiagnosed attention deficit, which apparently was diagnosed. My parents didn't do anything about it. So in my 30s, I suddenly realized, I had ADHD, and there's a lot of comorbidity between bulimia and ADHD. But primarily, and the thing that was hardest for me to write about in this book, and probably the thing I was most ashamed of, is I had a mother who literally never attached to me and did pretty much everything in her power to hurt me. And this didn't just go on for a few years. It's really been my entire life. And after a lot of good therapy and guidance, I got the diagnosis for her of borderline personality disorder, and there are a lot of bulimic women with borderline mothers. To me, it's one of the most under-recognized things that's talked about out there.
It's important to understand that, because if you don't get to the root cause of it, you're bound to fail.
You're right, and I feel so strongly about this because people will judge people if they cut off contact with a borderline parent. However, in many cases, it is more toxic for you and your family and your children if you remain in contact with somebody who is that destructive. So I had to take the highly unusual step about 8 years ago of literally needing to stop contact, because if I hadn't done that, my recovery would have been in jeopardy. It's not that I'm not a loving person. It's not that I didn't try. The book talks about all the ways I tried and family therapy.
Right.
And it was in one family therapy scene where my mother said that I had, embarrassed her and my father by vomiting my way through Harvard. And then they offered up this explanation to the psychologist, and they asked if I was brain damaged and if that had been the problem in the family. And I'll never forget this psychologist looking at them and saying, "Your daughter is not brain damaged." And that was another turning point for me, because somebody was in my corner who had finally stood up to my parents and said, "She's not the problem." So my recovery had many layers, and it's about just continuing to face one thing after the next. You couldn't have told me this 25 or 30 years ago. I thought it was very simple. You stop purging. But if you want to stay in recovery and get happy, it's a long journey of self-discovery, but it's a great journey, and you really can come to a fantastic place. I'm the healthiest and happiest I've ever been.
That's what I wanted people to hear from you, because it is doable, and you can succeed. You also added other things that you did. You stop at one helping when you eat, right?
I do. There are a few slogans from my support group that I've never forgotten. One is, the first bite is the best. You never know what phrase is going to change the way you think, but for some reason that little pamphlet said it all. It's like, oh, really? So if the first bite's the best, why go to two? And it doesn't work for everybody. It worked for me. But a lot of slogans like keep it simple, stupid, one day at a time, attitude of gratitude. And interestingly enough, I got a master's degree in applied positive psychology a few years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, and it's the science of happiness. And one of the things I unpacked, all these years later, was that many of the things I've done instinctively or through that group or through the guidance of other people, I can all now kind of match to theories that I have learned in positive psychology. And in the end of the book, I offer some prescriptions that are really new, that I hope are game changers for some people, because some of what I did and I learned to do that kept me in this great place, I've never seen suggested by anybody. I've never seen a therapist write about peak end theory or say even strengths, finding your strengths and doing a me at my best exercise. So there's so many new things in this book that I hope help people to live differently and flourish.
If somebody who's listening is suffering from bulimia or knows somebody who is, what is the very first step that they can do?
Well, the beauty of the eating disorder field is there's lots of help available now. So there's Google bulimia or anorexia or eating disorders, and there are wonderful websites, ANAD and the National Eating Disorder Association. Get some facts. Reach out yourself to somebody who's in recovery. Call them. Find solutions and hotlines. But confront someone with an eating disorder in a very delicate way. Come to them and say, I care about you and I love you and I think this disease may have gotten control of you. How can I help you? If someone needs you to go to their first, say, Overeaters Anonymous meeting or Eating Disorders Anonymous meeting, offer to take them and sit in the parking lot so that you don't judge them. But get them somewhere, because there's a lot of help available and there's a lot of hope. And I hope now that we can now have long-term recovery as part of the discussion, too.
And, of course, read Positviley Caroline, How I Beat Bulimia for Good by Carolyn Adams. And, Carolyn, very quickly, if someone wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Go to my main website. It's CarolineMiller.com, Caroline at Caroline Miller, and I will answer everybody myself.
Caroline, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That's our show for today. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to follow me on my website, thedrsashow.com. We'd love to hear from you, so drop us a line or two about what you think of the show and any topics that you would like to hear about. Until next week, this is Dr. A, wishing you a healthy and happy week.